Hi, my name is Grace, and I am the Intercultural Communications Manager for African Education Network, AEN. We're so excited that you've decided to volunteer with us. This is a video-based version of our pre-departure orientation that accompanies our workbook. To make sure you get as much out of your experience as possible, our team hopes to build your cultural competence and cross-cultural communication skills. In particular, this training will consider the iceberg model of culture, your identity and motivations, dimensions of culture, communication styles, cultural adjustment, along with some challenges you may encounter. The video will be a review of the workbook and include moments for you to pause and think about reflection questions. So let's get started. The iceberg model is very commonly used to explain culture because, like icebergs, there is a section that is visible and above water, and then there's this much larger section that's invisible and underwater. So, for example, aspects like food and dress can be very obvious, but courtesy and sense of time are less obvious. Going deeper into another culture and trying to understand its underlying beliefs and values can help us get past our assumptions and build deeper connections. The next parts of the workbook are really about reflecting on your culture and background, along with your values and motivation, because all of these elements can really impact your experience of another culture and your work as a volunteer. Self-reflection is a crucial part of your preparation. A moment to pause here and think about the following reflection questions. Which motivations are most important to you? How do you think your motivations might impact your experience volunteering? What are some personal goals you have for yourself? And what do you hope to accomplish through your volunteer experience? What are some factors that will make volunteering a success and what might make it challenging? We also hope you think about these questions related to your cultural values and personal history. What cultural values have been passed down by your parents or caregivers? What about your ancestors? What cultural practices did you adopt that were influenced by your surroundings or region? What words of wisdom, stories, or idioms shaped your cultural values or cultural practices? How do your cultural values or practices influence how you solve problems, manage change, approach work, raise children, and etc.? We encourage you to take the GlowSmart assessment at learning.aperienglobal.com. All you need is your school email to access the web resources. The GlowSmart profile allows you to see how your preferred work style compares with average styles of people from other countries on 5 dimensions of culture: independence, egalitarianism, risk, directness, and task-orientedness. Take the survey and find out how you compare. It's also important to consider the various dimensions of culture that influence our communication and behaviors. Researchers have identified 5 elements that are globally applicable in various aspects of life. The first is power distance, or how people respond to power and authority in a culture. A high power distance culture has greater respect for authorities like bosses and teachers, who tend to have more control. In lower power distance cultures, subordinates are more likely to challenge or question authorities. The second dimension is known as uncertainty avoidance. Cultures that are low in this dimension tend to take risk and initiative and value conflict. Cultures that are high in uncertainty avoidance focus more on group harmony and seek out clear rules, procedures, and job responsibilities. The third dimension is individualism, collectivism, or whether people think about themselves more as group members or individuals. In individualistic cultures, people are expected to look out for themselves, while in collectivistic cultures, people emphasize loyalty to the group. The masculinity-femininity dimension refers to how genders are defined. In cultures rated high on masculine dimensions, males are expected to be in charge. Other cultures have more fluid roles between males and females. Long-term orientation refers to how people think about their relationship to time. A long-term orientation emphasizes the future through values such as perseverance and thrift. A short-term orientation focuses on the past and present and tends to emphasize respect for tradition. You can check out how the scores for your country on the 5 dimensions compare to the scores of your host country at herthofstata.com. Some questions to consider include: do you feel that there's truth in the scores? Why or why not? How would you use the scores to help you adjust to and navigate the host country? So the next section of this training focuses on communication. Communication involves both the verbal and nonverbal messages you send. Communication can involve messages that you aren't even aware of. Most of the time, the sent message is not equal to the received message because receivers will still decode the message through their perspective. The greater the difference between the sender and receiver of the message, the greater the difference between the meanings attached to the words and behaviors. We hope to help you reflect on your communication styles. Differences in style include linear versus circular. In linear communication, the emphasis is really about getting the point quickly and explicitly so as to not waste the other person's time. In circular communication, making the point explicitly can be seen as insulting the person, and the point may be unstated because the idea is that indirect verbal and nonverbal information should be sufficient for understanding. In direct communication, one states what one means in a straightforward way without beating around the bush. In indirect communication styles, meaning is communicated in more subtle ways through nonverbal behaviors, stories, and implications. Indirectness is supposed to reflect politeness and respect. In formal communication styles, there are strict rules about how people should be addressed and what topics should be discussed. In informal communication styles, people have greater flexibility about what they want to say. In low-context communication, information in the exchange is not assumed to be known. Things must be explained clearly, unambiguously, and precisely. In high-context communication, it is assumed that the context is known. It would therefore be insulting and unnecessary to state meaning precisely. In attached communication styles, there is more feeling and emotion in communication. In detached styles, communication is carried out in a calmer and more impersonal manner, which is valued for its objectivity. In idea-focused communication, the emphasis is on the ideas that are seen as separate from the person. In person-focused communication, there is a great importance attached to the feelings and ideas of that person. One should therefore be very careful when disagreeing with another's ideas. In task-focused communication, the emphasis is on the completion of a task over group harmony, or another person's feelings. In relationship-focused communication, maintaining harmony is central, and completing the task should not come at the expense of a group or a person. It's important to remember that all of these elements are part of a spectrum, right? People are oftentimes not one or the other, but a mixture of these factors. But it's also important to consider how to get past our own assumptions about how people ought to communicate or what we understand respect to be. Some reflections to think about in this section include: was there a time when your intended message was different from the message someone received? Why did this gap in understanding occur? Did you do anything to close it? Which of your communication tendencies seem to be most extreme? How might you be able to adjust your style to someone who communicates in the opposite manner? Also of relevance are the stages of cultural adjustment. While being abroad can be exciting, many individuals experience culture shock. This process can be very challenging. There are 4 stages of culture shock: honeymoon, frustration, adjustment, and acceptance. Individuals experience these stages differently, and the impact of each stage can vary. Even so, these stages can help us understand how we adapt and cope with new cultures. In the honeymoon phase, people initially feel excited and motivated. In the culture shock phase, the novelty of the new culture has worn off, and people are now mainly focused on stressful differences and become homesick. In the gradual adjustment phase, people become more familiar with the new culture and feel less isolated, with their sense of humor returning. After the initial phases of adjustment, they can enter a stage of deeper learning and question their assumptions. In the 4th phase, they no longer feel uncomfortable, but feel at home in their new environment. Aspects of culture that are different from their home country no longer affect them in a negative way, as they live and work to their full potential. It is important to recognize that these challenges exist and that it's not a sign of weakness to admit them. During this time, it's important to take care of yourself, develop relationships, and actively try to learn more about the host country. While it's good to reach out to friends and family back home for support, it's also important to have an open mind rather than to idealize conditions at home. Have you experienced any of these stages before? What are examples of each stage? How did you cope with the experience? Next are some situations you may encounter. Utilize what you've learned in the previous exercises to respond to how you might deal with each of the situations. In the first situation, dinner is almost over and you feel full, but your host family offers you more food. How would you react? In the second situation, you notice that for over a week, your host mother has been sulky and unhappy about something. Being an indirect person, she'd rather not say anything to you. You don't know the reasons, but you suppose she might be unhappy about the way you're doing something. You want to clarify the situation. What can you do to make things clear? The next situation, you find that you never have time for yourself. There's always someone around and you need space. How do you deal with this? Thank you for taking the time to reflect on and review key concepts in intercultural communications. If you have any specific questions about the culture of a host country, such as etiquette, body language, or workplace culture, feel free to reach out to our team based in the host country for additional support. Wishing you safe and wonderful travels.